Back to the beginning of Reconstruction. So, remember, we fought the Civil War, and, the Civil War, as it drew to a close, and as it became apparent that the Civil War was drawing to a close, the issue became, what should happen in the aftermath of that war. Now, we said that the war resolved a couple of things. It resolved whether or not the country was a union of independent states or a nation, indivisible. It resolved the issue of slavery and created what Lincoln called a new birth of freedom. And we talked about those things. But we also said that the war raised a number of important questions. What would become of the ex-slaves? And how would the former Confederate states be reincorporated into the Union? Those were kinds of questions that emerged even as early as 1863. And they emerged in 1863 because Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee all had fallen under Union control. And so the question was how to establish civil governments in those states. And in December of 1863, Lincoln put forth his 10% plan. You should have a familiarity with Lincoln's 10% plan. Remember, Lincoln offered to any ex-Confederate, non-high-ranking official amnesty if they would pledge allegiance to the Constitution. Once 10% of the people who had voted in the 1860 election had taken such a pledge, then those people could form a new state government that would abolish slavery, maybe provide for the education of black children, and possibly enfranchise black veterans of the Civil War, but for the most part left the details of what those governments would look like to that small faction of people that would create those new governments. Now, remember we said from the very outset that there was a faction of Republicans called the Radical Republicans. Now, the Radical Republicans are never going to be really in the majority, but they might influence the majority at times, and they were people that leaned more towards justice. They wanted to punish the South for what they had done. They wanted to enfranchise and embrace African Americans and ensure that they would have equal rights, sometimes for benevolent reasons, other times simply because they wanted to punish the South. Their alternative to Lincoln's 10% plan was what? What was the alternative? It was in July of 1864 that it passed, yes. The Wade-Davis bill was the alternative to Lincoln's 10% plan, right? And Wade and Davis were both of the radical faction. They proposed 50%, far more stringent guidelines, disenfranchising former Confederates. Their legislation would not have allowed them to participate in these new governments. What happened to the Wade-Davis bill? What happened to the Wade-Davis bill? Yes. It died in pocket veto, and remember, it's going to die in the summer of '64. Now, in the summer of '64, the war is not yet over, right? The war isn't over yet in the summer of '64. And the debate over Reconstruction is already kind of established between those that wanted healing, including Lincoln, and those who wanted justice, the Radical Republicans in Congress, right? Now, we said that those groups are going to unify, those Republican factions in the North are going to unify to elect Lincoln in 1864, and then unify to pass the 13th Amendment. Oh, incidentally, you should have a familiarity, and this will help you greatly, with the 3 Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment made them citizens and gave them equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment provided for the enfranchisement of African American males, gave slaves the vote, right? 13, 14, and 15th Amendment. We'll come back to them. Now, we said even though Lincoln and the Radicals joined together to elect him as president and join together to pass the 13th Amendment, they are going to re-separate over accepting Tennessee as a reconstructed state. Remember, Congress rejects Tennessee organized under Lincoln's 10% plan. But they do reunify in March of 65. The war's still not over yet, to establish the Freedmen's Bureau. Right? The Freedmen's Bureau, there will be several questions on the test about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a relief agency that was created to address the very real problem of the freed 4 million liberated slaves in a decimated Southern society. Right? So we said the Freedmen's Bureau came down, representatives from the Freedmen's Bureau, employees of the Freedmen's Bureau of the federal government came down to provide relief, to support the former slaves. Right? Now, one of the things, probably the biggest thing that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to do is build schools. Right? Those former slaves are going to covet education. I mean, we talked about this a little bit. You know, a lot of what, you know, the former slaves wanted had to do with what they observed during slavery, right? And what they observed during slavery is that if you could read and were educated, then you had opportunities, right? And they wanted to prevent slaves from being able to read, so they sought, you know, education. The Freedmen's Bureau was supportive. What was the Southern response to the Freedmen's Bureau? What did they think? I mean, the South, yes, go ahead, Bob. Pardon me? The Ku Klux Klan isn't going to respond to the Freedmen's Bureau immediately, right? I mean, the KKK isn't going to come down for a while, yes. No, I guess what I was looking for is white Southerners looked at the Freedmen's Bureau as Northern meddling in their business. They didn't like it. They saw the Freedmen's Bureau as coming down, emboldening their former slaves to resist them, intruding in what they considered their business. And when we talk about their business, the white South is going to maintain that the relations between their former slaves and themselves and the status of those slaves, those former slaves in that society in the South, was the purview of the whites in the South. And this is why they resist with such vigor, radical Reconstruction. Because with radical Reconstruction, Northerners are trying to create a different society than what white Southerners envisioned to be. Right? They wanted a racially segregated, stratified society that put blacks in a lower position. The radical Republicans wanted equal protection under the law. Right? So this is going to be fundamentally different. Right? So the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be something that is going to be resisted. Remember, after, and we mentioned this, after, the southern states were reconstructed under presidential Reconstruction, right? And it's rejected by Congress, and they go down and they do that investigation, and they find out that, from the very start, white Southerners were not sorry about what had happened in the Civil War. They were sorry that they lost. Right? And they said they hate, remember the poem was, we hates the Constitution, we hates the Declaration of the Constitution too. We hate the Freedmen's Bureau in their uniforms of blue. Right? So they even say that in that poem. Now, we know that Lincoln dies, he's assassinated in April, the war ends, Johnson takes over, and Johnson is going to continue Lincoln's Reconstruction program for the most part. Now, there are going to be some differences between Johnson and Lincoln's plan, but for the most part, Johnson wants to focus on healing, right? Remember, Johnson, is going to recognize states that had been organized under Lincoln's plan and then give an alternative plan for the other states that was very similar to Lincoln's, with the exception that people that owned more than $20,000 worth of property would have to seek a personal pardon from him, which he granted with, great liberality. Now, by December of '65, as we talked about, all of the ex-Confederate states, with the exception of Texas, had either complied with Lincoln or Johnson's plans. They were ready to enter the Union. Right? They were ready to re-enter the Union. They had all all of those states had written new constitutions. They had all ratified the 13th Amendment. This is what Johnson and Lincoln insisted that they do, right? They had elected new state officers. They had elected new federal officers, congressmen appointed senators. All that had to happen is that those new elected and appointed representatives to the U.S. House of Representatives and the Congress had to take their seats, right? And that would have been in December of '65. Congress refused to seat them for two reasons. What were the two reasons that the majority of Congress rejected presidential reconstruction? Yes, go ahead. Say it again. Many of those who were going to be seated as representatives of the former Confederate states had been high-ranking officials pardoned by Johnson, right? And when he granted those pardons with great liberality, high-ranking officials who were going to come and take their seats. And they deeply resented that. In addition to that, there was another thing that they deeply resented. What was that? That all of those states had passed, yes, go say it.
Black codes.
The Black Codes. Now the Black Codes, how were the Black Codes different from the Jim Crow laws? What was the difference between the Black Codes and the Jim Crow laws? So you'll have questions on the Black Codes and questions on the Jim Crow laws.
The Jim Crow law was segregation, and like the Black Code was all slavery, but not actual slavery.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. The Jim Crow laws were passed to segregate Southern society after, right, radical Reconstruction collapses in '77. The Black Codes were enacted to establish kind of a relationship between white Southerners and African Americans, to establish a status of black people. Now there are similarities, but the Jim Crow laws were the catalyst for the 14th Amendment, right? The Jim Crow laws, the Black Codes were the catalyst of the 14th Amendment. The Black Codes seemed like a backdoor way of reinstating slavery in the South, and really challenged whether the North had really won the war. And so as a result of those Black Codes, right, Congress is going to reject presidential reconstruction. They will insist that the Freedmen's Bureau be extended for another year. They will pass a Civil Rights Act that basically made the Black Codes illegal. How does Johnson respond to Congress's reaction to presidential reconstruction? Go ahead, Bobby. He vetoes both of those bills, and when he does, Congress responds by overriding his veto, but also proposing and passing the 14th Amendment. Now, what was the 14th Amendment intended to do? What was the 14th? Yes. Yes, it was intended to, it may remember, the 14th Amendment defines citizenship. If you were born on U.S. soil or naturalized, you were a U.S. citizen. If you were a United States citizen, states could not abridge, your immunities and privileges, or they had to provide equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment is the cornerstone of congressional/radical Reconstruction. And Congress insisted that the ex-Confederate states ratify the 14th Amendment and live by it as a condition for readmission into the Union. What did Johnson recommend to those ex-Confederate states? What did he recommend about the 14th Amendment? Did he recommend that they should ratify it or not? Not, yes. And so it sets up a showdown. And the showdown is decided in the congressional elections of '66. But prior to the congressional elections of '66, right, Johnson takes a swing around the circle. What is the swing around the circle? Go ahead. Yeah, it's when Johnson goes out and tries to support and promote candidates that are going to support presidential reconstruction, healing, right? And remember, we talked about Johnson, and his behavior there and how much it hurt. And the end result was that the Republicans won supermajorities in both the House and both the Senate in the aftermath of the '66 election. With those supermajorities, they are going to insist on the 14th Amendment being passed, right? And then they are going to throw out presidential reconstruction. So just for the sake of putting a perspective on it, we did this on the board. Presidential reconstruction starts with Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln, focusing on kind of rapidly healing the wounds of the Union and joining the states back together, believing that the states had never really seceded in the first place, believing that all that had to happen is loyal people had to be put in control, making it fairly easy for those states to do so, but giving them a tremendous amount of autonomy in how they create their new governments, particularly when it came to African Americans, right? The battle between that and the radicals that wanted a plan that emphasized more justice is going to culminate with the '66 elections, right? With those '66 elections, and when the Republicans take supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, now they are going to throw out presidential reconstruction and implement the First, Second, and Third Reconstruction Acts, right, that are going to be based on the 14th Amendment, right? The First, Second, and Third Reconstruction Acts that creates what we call congressional or radical reconstruction. Now, in terms of congressional and radical reconstruction, we know that the centerpiece of congressional or radical reconstruction was that African American males had to be enfranchised and had to have the ability to participate in those newly minted Republican governments, and they did. We mentioned that a coalition of scallywags, carpetbaggers, and freed slaves made up the voting population that would vote in Republican governments in those states, right? Now, we've talked a little bit about how effective those governments were or they were not. And what we said is there is kind of a mixed legacy. Was there corruption in those governments? Yes. But one thing to point out is that corruption was widespread across America at this time. There were corruption in northern governments. There was corruption in the Grant administration, right? So to point out the corruption of those southern governments seems to be a little bit unfair. And there were also examples of how those southern governments really, really, really advanced Southern society that had been previously, stagnated. What was the response of the majority of white Southerners to those new radical regimes, and what embodied their response? Go ahead, Jake. The Ku Klux Klan. Remember, the Ku Klux Klan, was described as the military arm of the Democratic Party. Right? The Democratic Party, who had been fundamentally disenfranchised by congressional reconstruction, right, sought to reestablish control dominated by white people. In order to do that, the Klan used violence and intimidation in order to intimidate all factions of those Republican regimes, scallywags, carpetbaggers, and particularly freed slaves from participating in those governments so that they would collapse and white rule would be redeemed. Now, we talked about the Ku Klux Klan and the success of the Klan. And look, at first, the white North is going to respond to the Klan with the Force Act of 1870 and the KKK Act of 1871. And Grant is going to, kind of effectively enforce those pieces of legislation and really bring the Klan under control, right? But eventually, the Northern commitment to maintaining those governments in the South is going to wane. And a mindset is going to emerge that the only way to provide stability in the South is to allow the rightful leadership class to retake power. Now, we know that this finally culminates with the election of '76. Oh, incidentally, who were the candidates in the election of 76? Who were the candidates in the election of 76? Yes.
Hayes and Tilden.
Yes, Hayes and Tilden. And what was the eventual compromise of 77 regarding that election? Go ahead, Robbie.
The Democrats get the end of the Reconstruction and Hayes is
Yes. Hayes is agreed in this contended election that they'll count the votes that would give Hayes the election in return for Hayes agreeing to remove all Southern troops from the South. Right? One thing that there'll be questions on as well, you know, in this is the you know, along this continuum of Reconstruction is Johnson's impeachment. Oh, by the way, what was the legislation that was used as the basis for impeaching Johnson in 1868? Yeah, go ahead, Devon.
Tenure of office act.
The Tenure of Office Act. And was Johnson convicted? No. He was not convicted. He was not removed from office by a very narrow vote. But there was an agreement, really, but between Johnson, a tacit agreement between Johnson and the Republicans that he would back down. And also a recognition that Grant would become president and would be elected to be the president in 68. What was Grant's administration known for primarily, incidentally? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question.
Yes, good.
So with the tenure of office act, I know there's another act. that
Yeah,
you
the
want-
Command of the Army.
What was that?
The Command of the Army Act said that Johnson could only give orders to the Army through Grant, the commander of the Army. In terms of Grant's administration, there is going to be, you know, I mean, obviously the big problem associated with Grant is that he surrounds himself with people that take advantage of his good nature. Grant himself is never really, you know, never really caught or accused of taking any kind of money. But people associated with him that he trusted do so. And he's accused of being naive politically, not really, you know, aware of, you know, of politics, and trusting these people to too great an extent. The big scandal in his administration is the credit mobilier scandal. And you'd want to take a look at that in your notes. Incidentally, just a hint, the credit mobilier scandal involves railroads. Now, in the notes that I gave you about politics in the Gilded Age, and you know, we went through a pretty extensive review a moment ago of questions about, you know, radical Reconstruction. That's chapter 22 in your text. That one we covered pretty carefully, right? And we covered some topics in chapter 23 in your text pretty carefully as well. I mean, there's Grant's election is in chapter 23 in your text, right? His election in 68. His re-election in 72 is in chapter 23 in your text. Now, who did Grant run against in 72? Greeley, right? He ran against Greeley. And what party was Greeley in? What party was Greeley in? He was endorsed by the Democrats, but remember, he was a Republican. He was a part of a faction of Republicans that they're called liberal Republicans, eventually mugwumps, right? Who were so disgusted with Grant and so frustrated with Reconstruction that they nominated their own third-party candidate, Horace Greeley, and the Democrats, desperate to win, also nominated him, hoping that he would defeat Grant in 72. He does not defeat Grant in 72. Now, by 72, and definitely by 76, the Republicans were divided into three factions. And I asked you questions on the test about these three factions. The liberal Republicans, the good government, the best people should govern Republicans, called themselves the mugwumps. They were the people that bolted the party in 72 against Grant. The stalwarts were the machine Republicans. They were the people that supported Grant. They supported patronage, right? They were not uncomfortable with the scandals that were involved in the Grant's administration. You know, they were followers of a New York senator by the name of Roscoe Conklin. Another faction, the half-breeds, were Republicans that at least said they were somewhat disgusted with corruption, but really they just competed with the stalwarts for power, and they were led by James Blaine of Maine. Now, in terms of politics during the Gilded Age, the notes that I gave you are going to highlight a number of things. But one thing they'll highlight is that one of the defining features of the political situation of the Gilded Age was parity. The Republican and Democratic parties were absolutely, I don't want to say absolutely equal, but their power was fairly close to being equal, right? The Republican Party was mainly the party of the North, right? They were the party of the Union Army. They were the party of New England and the Midwest, right? And they were the party that could wave the bloody shirt. You'll see that term on the test, waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt became, what would you call it? A symbol, an alleged symbol of blaming the Democratic Party for the Civil War. Right? Allegedly, a congressman came in, a Republican congressman, and waved a bloody shirt and said, "Those Democrats are responsible for this blood." Right? So waving the bloody shirt was the most powerful imagery that the Republican Party had. And they played that card right up until 1900. Right? That the Democrats were the party of rebellion, that the Democrats were the party of insurrection, that the Democrats were the party of blood, and they had the blood on their hands for the Civil War. And that gave them a powerful position. The Democratic Party, however, was competitive almost equally for every single election during the period. The Solid South after Reconstruction was deeply Democratic, right? Solidly Democratic. And they saw radical Reconstruction as their own form of a bloody shirt. And in every election, 76 being an example of it, 80 a further example, 84, 88, 92, the parties were very, very close. You know, and it's one of the reasons why there was such high voter turnout during the period. I mean, the Gilded Age is going to see, you know, some of the highest voter turnout in American history, and one of the reasons is that the parties were so equally matched. Another reason that is discussed frequently in the notes that I gave you, and in the book and the things that I want you to read, is patronage. Now, patronage is going to be the source of kind of energy of both political parties. And what we mean by patronage is that when a party won power, they would put their supporters into government jobs as rewards. Jackson starts this. He calls it the spoils system, right? Or it's called the spoils system. Now, but by the time the Gilded Age rolls around, patronage had really exploded. And both parties, when they took power, would replace large numbers of federal workers with their own people. And office seeking became something that was widespread and frustrating for many of the people that were involved in politics during that time. In fact, Garfield is assassinated. The president that's elected in '84 is assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. Now, you should look in your notes and look at the election of, we talked about 72, we talked about 76, read about the election of 80, Garfield is elected, assassinated, 84, Cleveland is elected, right, first Democrat, 88, Harrison we talked about today, 92, Cleveland is reelected. You should have a familiarity with the issues in those elections, right? Now, at the same time, we did also talk about today that while those politics was emerging in the nation, the status and condition of the former slaves in the aftermath of Reconstruction was also emerging. There are going to be questions on the test about the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that we discussed today. What was the final ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson?
That, the Jim Crow laws, it didn't violate the 14th.
Right, separate but equal. That the Jim Crow laws that were passed after, radical Reconstruction ended, that segregated the South, were in fact constitutional, right? That separating the races was not a violation of the 14th Amendment as long as that separation was equal, right? Now, there will be a question on the test about the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is the first piece of legislation that attempts to reform the civil service. That was named after the person who championed the act. It's sometimes called the Civil Service Act or the Pendleton Act. Now, it was the first meaningful civil service reform that was passed in American history. Yes. Civil service, I'm glad you asked. The civil service is the people that work for government, right? So when we talk about patronage, what's happening is the people that work for government are being replaced every time someone new is elected into office, right? So this was a powerful motivation to get your guy elected. I mean, if you had a job, you knew you'd lose it if your guy lost his seat, right? If you wanted a job, you know you could only get it if your guy got a seat. So the Pendleton Act came in and said, look, this is bad. We need to reform this. So you should read about the Pendleton Act, and I put that in those notes that I gave you. So there are a number of questions in those notes that I gave you. Now that takes us to where we were today in the $1 billion Congress, right? The $1 billion Congress is in the Harrison administration. Harrison is elected in '88. With him, a Republican House and a Republican Senate, right? They are going to pass. You imagine. They are going to pass, they are going to pass those 4 pieces of legislation that we put up on the board, right, today. The McKinley tariff, they're going to pass the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, they're going to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the Pension Reform Act, right, or the Pension Act. We put those on the board. Now, we talked about the backlash against that. And we set up the Populist Party in '92. And we said that the Populist, yes.
What did the Sherman Antitrust do?
The Sherman Antitrust Act we're actually going to come back and talk about later. But the Sherman Antitrust Act was a way of breaking up trust. But that we have no context on that right now, right? So we're not going to talk about it. One thing we are going to talk about is that the emergence of the Populist Party in '92, right, is going to be part of the backlash against the $1 billion Congress and what seemed to be the insensitivity of both parties to the needs of farmers, right? And we talked about that a little bit today. That farmers across the country are going to feel, and they made up 50% of the population, that they are languishing while everyone else is prospering at their expense. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, and we'll talk about it tomorrow, and it kind of connects to this, is that the Populist Party is going to rise up, right? And, people in the West are going to join it, and people in the South are going to consider joining it. But the Populist Party never is really going to take hold in the South because the Democratic Party is going to be the party of the white man in the South, right? And even though a lot of African Americans and a lot of poor whites are going to connect to populism, and that many blacks are going to be attracted, as are poor whites going to be attracted to populism, the leadership class in the South the Bourbon Democrats, as they are called, are going to play the race card hard and say, are you willing to abandon, the position of the white man in the South for these issues of the Populist Party? And the rise of the Populist Party, and the interest of many African Americans in it, and the potential for some whites to join with them against the Democratic Party, is going to cause a violent backlash against blacks in the South. The Jim Crow laws, lynchings, other manifestations of a real significant backlash, political disenfranchisement, a lot of that is going to be motivated by the rise of the Populist Party. And I don't know how much I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Now, in terms of chapter 26, right, there are going to be several questions in chapter 26 about topics relating to the settlement of the Trans-Mississippi West. Let me give you a few things to think about. One is something called the Buffalo Soldiers. There'll be a question on the test about the Buffalo Soldiers, so you should read about that. But the Buffalo Soldiers were African American soldiers that were deployed in the Indian Wars in the West. The biggest part of that chapter is going to talk about the kind of final conflict between white settlement and the Native Americans, right? By the time of the Civil War, most Native Americans had either been marginalized on small reservations in the East or pushed across the Mississippi River into what we know as the Trans-Mississippi West. Now, when white settlement crosses the Mississippi, those African Americans are not African Americans, excuse me, those Native Americans are going to kind of violently encounter, right, the final settlers that come into this area. And the Indian Wars, as they are going to be called, are going to be a big part of the narrative of that period, right? And they are discussed in chapter 26 in your text. And the Buffalo Soldiers were African American soldiers who were deployed, to fight the Native Americans as a part of those Indian Wars. Also, something else I want you to note is a book that was written in 1881 by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson. The name of the book was A Century of Dishonor, right? And it was written in the time, and it chronicled the terrible way that whites had treated Native Americans for the past century, a century of dishonor. Right? So that book, a knowledge of that book would be important. The book is entitled A Century of Dishonor, and the author is Helen Hunt Jackson. Also, two pieces of legislation. They're going to be mentioned in chapter 26. One is the Dawes Act, D-A-W-E-S. D-A-W-D-S. Who was that guy with, oh geez, that's somebody's dad. No, the other guy. I know him. I know him. I know he's somebody's dad. Yeah, I mean, somebody music, but I know him. I should have said it loud. I feel badly. I can't remember who it was, though. I mean,
you can still catch it.
All right, so back to the Dawes Act, D-A-W-E-S. The Dawes Act was the legislation that was passed to deal with the Native American problem in the Trans-Mississippi West. And what the Dawes Act was intended to do was to assimilate Native Americans into white culture. It was intended to break up the tribe, right, the tribal unit, and to give, not, did I say African American? Indians, I meant to say Indians. To break up the tribal unit, to give Indian heads of households 160 acres of land to cultivate, right? So the Dawes Act was well-meaning in some ways, right? It said, okay, we're tired of fighting with the Native Americans. We want them to assimilate into the larger white culture, and to do so, we are going to make them farmers. right? We'll give them 160 acres of land, and they can cultivate that land, and they can farm just like white people who are coming over here can farm as well. But the Dawes Act failed to kind of like recognize the nature of Indian culture and life, you know, and so even though it may have been well-meaning, it ended up, you know, having a very negative impact on Native Americans. The other piece of legislation that I want you to know is the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was legislation that granted white settlers a free 160 acres of land in the Trans-Mississippi West. 160 acres. So you got it for nothing. All you had to do was claim it.
Why would you
I guess because you could put your homestead on it, you know. I mean, I don't think it was named after somebody, but I think you could put your homestead. One of the things that was, there was criticism of the Homestead Act that in the Trans-Mississippi West, 160 acres of land was not enough. Right? It was not enough land, you know. So all of those things that I mentioned in chapter 26, it's not everything, but those are some important things you should focus on when you're looking in that chapter. 160 acres? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Here you go.
Yeah. All right. For where we're at now, that's all I have. My suspicion is we're not going to get this all done tomorrow, that this test will probably be Friday. And I know that's the Mardi Gras, but you don't leave until after 4th, and that's our last period anyways. So we'll be able to do that, but we'll see.
No, they can't use that.
Yeah, but
Like usual.
that's usual. That's right. All right. Does anybody have any questions about this?